yet another episode of Freightonomics. Zach Strickland, Head of Market Intelligence. Tony Mulvey, Senior Research Analyst. Got it right. Hope everybody's having a great week this week. We have probably one of our early disruptions to the freight market looming. We've got the Canadian railway strike underway as of today. And we're going to talk about that, of course, along with your freight market and economics update. We also had some revisions to some government data that we're going to talk about in the labor market.
Yeah, the revisions, not a surprise.
Is it not?
No, because everything gets revised at some point. That's the challenge with the government data, is they want it to come out quickly. Typically, when they release something initially, it's not accurate. It is revised one way or another. So you've seen revisions like what we're going to talk about here in a little while, but what was significant was just the size of the revision, not necessarily the direction of the revision.
Right. I think, too, it's more relevant because this data is also, it's a pretty big indicator that the Fed has been leaning on in terms of keeping interest rates elevated.
That is true. Their reliance on, government data is one thing. It's the fact that, they're relying on lagging data is why their decisions always lag what should have happened, right?
Right.
We've talked about interest rate cuts on here and how it's probably late. They probably should have done it in July, if not earlier. Mm-hmm. Now we're talking about what's coming in September.
Yeah.
But then the fact is, it doesn't really matter when they cut because the actual impacts of the cut take time to play out as well. So it's not, we saw them raise interest rates and those impacts are just kind of hitting the economy now, almost a year after they stopped raising them. So it's like it took 12 months for the impacts to be felt. You may see it a little faster on when you start cutting, especially if you don't think they're going to cut all the way back down to 2% very quickly. But it's still going to take some time.
Speculation.
You still have to go and capital will start getting deployed in other ways than what it is currently once cuts are kind of underway.
Yeah. Well, before we get into the weeds there, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Netrodyne here. Remove the guesswork from driver management and fleet safety and start predicting your accident reduction cost savings. Netrodyne's AI-enabled video safety platform corrects unsafe driving habits, recognizing and reinforcing great driving. With the Green Zone score, your fleet of engaged drivers will protect your bottom line. Every 50 points earned is a 14% cut to your accident rate. And of course, I like the fact that we are talking about positive reinforcement in that situation and not negative reinforcement, which any driver out there that listens to this show, God bless you. You hear enough negative feedback out there. You are doing the bulk of the labor.
Yeah, absolutely.
All in this freight.
Absolutely. But Zach, I think touching on that, moving the freight, we need to set the stage on where we are in the freight market. So Zach, for your marketing 2, I'll count you in 3, 2, 1.
All right. Drivers, I wish I had better news for you because the tender rejection index, as is displayed, indicates that you don't have a lot of options out there. There are a lot of you, and you are hauling the freight with no problem whatsoever. Tender rejection rates remain below 4.5% and basically hovering right around this mark. I kind of thought we'd start to see this Labor Day run-up start now, but not so much just yet. Labor Day, of course, the next major holiday. During COVID, it was the peak holiday of tender rejection rate activity. I don't know that we're going to return to that here, but all eyes are going to be on this index as we run into Labor Day. Does it beat July 4th levels of over 6%, or do we stay underneath that? I think that's an indication of direction of this market as we move into peak season. Do we see something like 2019 where that orange line that you're looking at there has a 14.5% spike before returning more to normal levels, or do we kind of have a moderated view there? I think somewhere in between 7 and 14% is probably where we'll land, but time will tell. Market remains soft. Let's go to the next chart and look at demand overall. Of course, we're going to talk about the rail strikes and the impacts there, but so far, demand is really just holding steady. We're not seeing a lot of growth here or deterioration. We came out of our summer peak levels. A lot of that demand side growth was driven by the West Coast activity. A little bit of pull forward there, but That is kind of waning for the moment. We don't really see any reason to think that demand is going to spike in the near term. Let's look at a breakdown of the demand side because there is some nuance here. This is not all demand is created equal. Let's go to the next chart and look at length of haul. The big yellow line that's diverted from the rest of it is the short length of haul. We have had a tremendous growth in short length of haul. And if you actually weighted these independently, demand is slightly down year over year in terms of weighting all these differently, which I think you should.
Yeah, you absolutely should, because I mean that's that 100-mile or less band, not really a lane, or
It does not disrupt capacity like the long haul freight.
No, because if you went in and looked at rejection rates, they're always like, even in the tightest market, like that length of haul is always substantially lower. I mean, it hangs out in the 5% range in the tightest markets, and around 1%.
1% right now.
Yeah, so like it doesn't disrupt anything.
Also, if you're talking about a 100-mile load, that's less than a quarter of a day. Of potential activity. Now, some of those do take a day in terms of pickup and delivery, but when you're talking about the impact to capacity, when you're talking about an 800-mile plus load, which is represented in the LOTVI, that has far more significant demand on capacity. It definitely drags it down more so than these little short city loads, as we call them.
Yeah, the other side that the other chart we didn't get to is looking at O-Rail and breaking it out by international and domestic. And I think you've seen this massive run up in international, which is, think of it as your 20 TEUs, your 20-foot equivalents, and your 40-foot equivalents, basically coming off the steamship lines and moving inland. So think of it as that is the container versus the domestic, whether it's those 53-foots that JB Hunt, Schneider all move. Those typically get taking from a 40-foot, transloading into a 53-foot. That growth that you see in the international side is impressive because, one, to me, it signals container ship lines aren't needing containers to get back overseas as quickly.
Well,
they are now. You're starting to see it, but you wouldn't see the growth at this level maybe if that was necessarily the case.
This is a fragile ecosystem.
Yeah,
I wrote about this in the Daily Watch earlier in the week. For the Sonar subscribers, you'll know what I'm talking about. A little bit more analytic chart than I like to put in the Daily Watch there, but I think it's an important trend to watch. You see the domestic volumes there. That's your 53-footers, very fungible with over-the-road truckload capacity in yellow. And then you have the white line, which typically it's more efficient to just leave it on the rails
and get it to Chicago or
instead
get
of
it
transloading it in around the port. And what we've seen is during the middle of the year, or the summer here in June, we had a pretty big hiccup in the international sector. You see the drop there right before July 4th? Well, we also had a drop in empty container flow coming back to the West Coast. If they don't have enough 20s and 40s in China and Asia and some other countries, then they cannot ship the freight. So they are already running relatively low from that side of the world, and this is a big threat. So if we can't get containers back to the ports, and all it takes is one disruption.
You're starting to see like if you looked at international empty container volumes from Chicago to LA, like they've increased significantly over the last month, and I think that's
right in line with the international container flow to Chicago.
Yeah, so like that to me is the sign that they are trying to speed that process up. But it makes sense given the time frame, right? I mean, we're August 22nd. If those containers are going to get back overseas and then back here for, call it peak, like they need to be moving now and over the last month to do that, right? Like, or else they're going to miss the time frame. So I think that's part of why you're seeing.
Yeah, and something to keep in mind for later as we discuss the Canadian strikes is notice that we really haven't seen any growth here that looks like any kind of downstream impact from the Canadian railroads.
Yes, no.
Yeah.
It's so kind of moving now to economics. I think obviously the big release was the downward revision to the jobs number. We kind of hinted at it earlier. So employment report was revised. The benchmark was revised 818,000 jobs lower.
Put that into context for us. Like, what does 818,000 jobs lower mean?
Well, it averages out to basically 68 each month being lower by 68,000 jobs a
Right.
month. So being overstated by 68,000 jobs. It's basically 30% a month lower, the revision is. So that's through March of 2024. They do this every year. They reset the benchmark basically.
But they were already revising things
Lower.
lower.
Yeah. So this is a bigger, they're looking at the last year. So March 2023 through March 2024, revising that number lower by 818,000. Then you had, every other month this year been basically revised lower. So I think to me, it just shows the labor market as a whole is not, it's definitely not as on strong a footing as everyone kind of was, I don't say led to believe, but the data was saying was the case. Now you get these big revisions. It's not abnormal to see a downward revision in this benchmark.
Right.
But the size and magnitude is the part that's interesting. It was the largest revision since 2009. So,
Yeah, and I think the big takeaway here is that
and the Fed's making decisions based on
Fed's making decisions based on a number that has been consistently overstated for over a year, more than likely. I know this is just March to March, which we're in August.
Yeah.
As you mentioned earlier off the show, but I think the takeaway here is that maybe this accelerates some of the thought process around rate cuts as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think when you look at where the declines really were, I mean, it's pretty widespread in terms of percentage, right? Like
It's very evenly distributed. So it tells me that there is a systematic issue in the collection of this data.
Yeah.
In general, it's not a single industry that had some sort of outweighted influence, although professional and business services had the biggest downward revision, and that was one of the big growth figures. If you ever read between the headlines in January, February, this was actually the sector that really produced some of the more positive headlines. Was a lot of that professional and business service stuff, along with healthcare and government. But it is, to me, that's kind of a flag that I want to take a note of. Is we got this positive report in the winter, and it may not have been so
positive
looking back.
Yeah. So I think one of the things to highlight here is how this data is captured.
Don't rely on government data.
Well, yeah.
for your near-term business decisions.
Yeah, because again, I don't envy their jobs in any way, because trying to represent a U.S. government or U.S. population that has 337 million people, like trying to represent that is no easy task, and building out a representative database is not easy. But at some point you have to look at these downward revisions and the size and magnitude and try to refine your process. And the problem is it does take time to do that, and it's challenging in kind of capturing that. And I think that's why it's maybe not always the most reliable in looking at near-term decisions, right?
Listen, I'm not critical of anybody that attempts to collect data from numerous disparate sources across a wide network of individuals.
Yeah, it's 129,000 businesses that they basically service or survey governments and businesses, and then
it's not an easy job.
629 individual work sites that are, so it's very challenging.
Huge net to cast. But at the same time, when you have a consistency around the collection of that, you should start identifying it and resolving it, especially when you're talking about something as important as the labor market.
Yeah, and it probably would get, I don't want to say swept under the rug, but not as impactful if you weren't in this situation where we are right now, where the Fed is weighing policy decisions on this data. And so if they were kind of in this status quo period, like they kind of were last year, like you had similar, you didn't have the impact, but they were kind of, all right, we're going to stop and go into this status quo period. It wasn't as impactful or as, pronounced or headline grabbing.
2017, it wouldn't be a big deal, really, because we don't have a lot of changing monetary policy and economic policy decisions going on. But at the same time, I think obviously the takeaway for me is you have to watch the data and be mindful of it, because this is what sets a lot of policy decisions. But two, your business structure itself should not be changed using this information outside of the policy structure.
Yeah, I think it's great to look over the course of, however many, like a very long term, I think it sets that.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to make decisions in the next, 3 to 6 months, I mean, based on old data or severely lagging data, you're going to miss the mark most of the time.
Well, let's transition away from this and go into the Canadian Railway strike. Biggest topical story of the day here, and the headline here: Trudeau urges more talks as U.S. railroads brace for Canada rail shutdown. And we're talking about Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, Kansas City. Lock out Union Rail employees starting at 12:01 a.m. on Thursday. So it's
underway.
It's underway, and everybody's wondering, okay, what does this mean? Obviously, for anybody that is shipping freight or handling freight in Canada, this is a huge deal.
Yeah, it's a really big deal when you start looking at commodities moved along the rail, grain, energy products, things like that. Like that's far more important than say containers. But you look at it, it's between the two companies, so CPKC and CN, it's about 9,300 union employees that are on strike. But the interesting part is, so CPKC started embargoing all shipments originating in Canada, originating in the U.S., and anything destined for Canadian interchange. It started on Tuesday. So they were acting kind of ahead. And I actually want to pull up a chart. We talked about rail volumes, looking at outbound container rail volumes from Canada or originating in Canada. You can see how quickly this has moved. I mean, this is on a moving average, and you've had about a 7% decline week over week. It's really 7% in like the last couple of days.
Well, they shut down there in early August. They were basically like, that's where they were starting to clear out a lot of the stuff. But then we had this huge rebound in activity as people are basically like, oh, crud, let's ship the stuff we have to ship today.
Let's get ahead of it.
Yeah, they were embargoing, of course, the hazmat stuff early in August to get ready for this. And I think, you've got a lot of automotive parts and things that move here. Canada isn't necessarily a huge container situation, but it is a big bulk.
Yeah.
You've got the bulk cargo stuff, you've got coal and all sorts of raw materials that move through this that literally have no other way of being transported.
Well, and the Canadian economy, so like the US, like there's options, right? Like if there were some rail disruption, like truckload is there, it would come at a premium cost, but it's an option. Right. In Canada, it's not built the same. Like the transportation networks are built very different, right? Typically, moves are made via rail, and then they're just trucked in very short distances. Very different again than the U.S. So it's far more impactful to the Canadian economy to have this than it is.
Well, I asked Mike Bowden-Distel, our rail expert here, what his hot take was for the day. He said, this is the main leverage that the union has. Would expect them to be ordered back to work by the labor minister with a binding arbitrated intervention in the coming days. Will be a mess to clean up and would take several weeks for the networks to be running at full fluidity again. So when you're talking about, I think people think, okay, once it's over and everything's fine. I think that's the biggest takeaway for me there is that it's not going to be over once they just go back to work. Yeah. Yes, maybe it's a few days, but we're talking about, anybody that relies on inbound Canada or outbound Canada, that has downstream impacts.
Yeah, it takes time.
It ripples.
We sat here and talked about the UAW strike last year, right? And like how you see production fall off and it took some time for it to ramp back up. Like it's not as easy as just flipping a switch and everything's back to normal. So I think and then you look at kind of the other impacts, looking at kind of inbound ocean volumes, like shippers are starting to move. Like that's the really upstream impacts too, is people that were using Canada and moving things along the rail.
Let's pull up the IOTI for China to Canada and China to the United States and China to Mexico, and just see exactly, because we talked about Mexico before and its growth, but nobody thinks about, we've also seen this growth into Canada as well in terms of IOTI is what I'm trying to pull up here, the sonar chart. There we go. If we can get that one up there. So the white line is inbound Canada containerized shipments. Now this is a relative view scale the shipment volume, this is not absolute. The shipment volume to Canada is a fraction of what it is to the United States and also Mexico. So keep that in mind. But the percentage growth here cannot be understated. When you're talking about the last month, we saw this huge surge of volume going into Canada. Guess what? Half of this freight has not landed in Canada yet.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a huge potential port container pileup.
Yeah.
The infrastructure may not be, you see the volume that it's used to handling there, and all of a sudden you're going to have this wave of potential import volume.
Yeah, I think the part to remember about Canada too is it is the shortest length of transit from China to North America. So I think there's some of that. I think you'll see some rerouting as well, moving from
I should say half of that big spiking white line there in August is what I'm talking about, not half of the whole thing.
Yeah. So, and then the other factor, I mean, you'll have diversions, right? Like they'll be like, well, we're not just take it from Prince Rupert or Vancouver. You did see some of that. You saw that start to decline pretty significantly. Inbound ocean TEU volumes into Prince Rupert and Vancouver, like they really started taking a hit, call it last week, 2 weeks ago, just kind of in preparation for this possibility.
But it's crazy to me, if we pull up this chart one more time, just to kind of put this into a little bit deeper context for North America in general, that's Canada in white. That's China to United States in purple, and China to Mexico in orange. So you're talking about like there has not really been a lot of diversion there in terms of import volume coming south from what it looks like.
Yeah, no, and some of this I don't know because again, these are based on the time of booking or the time of departure. So like if it was moving, call it the beginning of August, it may not be captured.
Right.
So I that's the part it's kind of hard to see. But I think one of the interesting things is going to be, how long does it take? And then to me, that diversion that we don't see it in this chart, but if you did look at the other ones, you can see it to some degree, is shippers are looking for certainty and and they're avoiding any uncertain areas. We're not far away from the potential of a East Coast port labor situation. Like it's within 6 weeks? I mean, it's the end of
30th deadline.
Yeah. So end of September. So you're talking, hey, some uncertainty around the ports at the end of September, like the West
Golden Week.
That West Coast, I mean, it could be your real big influx there.
Right. So, moving on to the other story, CSX got in well before a deadline here. Went ahead and negotiated. Now their situation a little bit different. 25% of the unionized labor force here was under some form of amenable contract. Now their contracts don't just expire.
Yeah.
They become amenable. They'll work with an extension unless they decide to strike.
They're effectively 5-year contracts that roll, and after 2 years they become amenable.
Right.
So
and I want to pull up the map here of the railroad networks. I got this from CN, Canadian National. The orange is Canadian National. The blue is the KC, Kansas City. So you see the extent, the reach there in the orange and the blue of what the striking rail network looks like.
Yeah.
That is a pretty big network overall. And, you've got... the CSX, it's harder to see there, but if you look at the scale on the side, it's in gray on the southeastern side of the country mainly. So they went ahead and kind of cleaned this up and said, we're not going to have this necessarily impact those networks, because that would have been pretty dramatic if that happened and the Gulf Coast and East Coast ports shut down.
Yeah, that would have been significant. I think you can see how expansive the two rail network, the two Canadian rail networks are the most expansive. They stretch from Pacific to Atlantic and from Canada down to the Gulf Coast and in some cases into Mexico, right? So they're quite expansive. I think what's going to be interesting is here in the US, like while the threat of a rail strike was there in the past, like the government was quicker to intervene ahead of time. The Canadian government has kind of let this happen, is going to deal with it kind of later after the fact, which is interesting considering how impacted their whole economy could be from this.
Yeah.
And I think that's the interesting part is like, you would think in Canada, which is far more progressive, far more labor union
Right.
kind of forward, you would think they would have worked to do this, before it happened and not after the fact.
And the last article that I'd like to recommend everybody go out to freightwaves.com and check out is Logistics Provider Says Canada Rail Strike Would Paralyze Ports. Stuart Churls, of course, writing this one, and he kind of outlines, interviews some people from C.H. Robinson, a lot of people involved in the Trans-Pacific trade routes and things like that, that basically say that there could be a pretty significant short-term impact on even domestic U.S. freight networks if something were to last longer.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that because, there is still, at some point, like most of those goods that are coming in, especially if they're containers. I mean, I know we talked about it being bulk, a lot of it, and commodities, but if it's containers going into Chicago, like it could be quite disruptive.
I'm looking at you, Otto. A lot of automotive
that
up
too.
here in Canada. So hopefully everybody gets this resolved and things can start moving fluidly once again.
We will see.